Thank you. And thank you so much to the organisers for inviting me here today. So, what I'm talking about today is a project that I've been working on for the last few years. It's an ethnographic research project on female Islamic authorities in the UK. And the idea for this project arose in the early 2000s, well, the mid-2000s, when I was involved in another project. And I started to notice the growing number of events, retreats, courses run by ustadas and sheikhs. And this is really a topic that we've touched on so much today, but and it's something. The topic of female scholarship is something that also Lewis and Hamid, in their recent book on British Islam, talk about. They see the influence of Muslim women in positions of authority as one of the seismic changes affecting British Muslims and the wider Muslim world. And I've put up on the slide a few of the initiatives that I'm talking about. So the Muslims and Women's Council in Bradford, that was mentioned earlier today in 2015, announced the intention of setting up a women-led mosque. We have the Muslim Council of Britain recently announcing a training programme to encourage more women in positions of leadership. The Women's Muslim College, which was set up in 2017 by Sheikha Safia Shahid, who's here in the audience with us today, and which offers training in Islamic sciences to women in 4 locations across the country. We have regular retreats. One of them, I attended a sisters' retreat in Wales, for example, organised by the Green Gate Trust, which is run exclusively by female scholars for women. When I attended, there was Ustada Badriya Tahan from Birmingham, Ustada Ifit, Ustada Misbah, and then there's, for example, the micro madrasa partly led by Ustada Najiba in Liverpool at Felicity House. And then there are a lot of also smaller initiatives which are maybe less visible for some reason. For example, Ustada Safia Dorat in Walthamstow set up Al Muhsinat, and various other kind of small initiatives that perhaps we know less about. There's also, I wanted to say, a political dimension to female leadership, which I think is important to point out, in that often the presence of more women in Muslim communities and in positions of leadership is celebrated by the media and by policymakers because it's often seen as a sign of Islam becoming more liberal, more inclusive, more. And so I think, and that's partly it's good to be, I think, wary about that, because often that also celebrates particular forms of leadership, particular forms of female scholarship, and not others, right? So just about my project. So this is a 3-year project, but it asks a lot of questions. But today I'm focusing particularly on 2 main questions. The first is around the extent to which this is a relatively new phenomenon, and if so, why? And the second one is really about trying to understand female authorities establishing kind of distinct female forms of knowledge and modes of authority, i.e., does gender matter in this? Or are they just doing what the men are doing, but for sisters only? So in terms of my method, I'm an anthropologist, so the first part I spent sort of mapping scholars and institutes across the country, and then I started doing some interviews looking at both biographies to paths to scholarship, but also looking at the work that scholars were doing. Where I looked at online presence, wherever possible I went to classes, to retreats, and I'm beginning to also talk to other experts in the field. I need to talk to more men. I don't have enough male voices. So I'm continuing the interviews. Most of the material some of it is anonymized, and some I use names because the scholars were happy for me to do so. And when I talk about authorities, I'm talking here about people who see themselves as scholars, teachers, preachers, and more recently, women involved in forms of guidance, so counsellors and chaplains. My work engages with the emerging literature on female Islamic scholarship and leadership. And I'm also interested in looking at how my work actually speaks to this idea of Islamic feminism. And I've found that many of the scholars and teachers don't really identify as feminists. They're really not interested in reinterpreting the text or adapting human rights analytical tools, nor resisting patriarchy. But they are drawing from within the Islamic tradition, drawing on female notions of piety, and at the same time they're trying to use this to kind of think of new possibilities, as Masouda Bano, for example, talks about in her own work, in their efforts to guide female Muslims and communities in the British context. So is this a new phenomenon? And I think that quote really sums it up. In a sense, there were women teaching Quran and in people's homes, in private settings, and so on. But what's really changed is that women are going public. They are setting up their institutes, leading larger classes, addressing a broader British Muslim audience. And of course, language, as has been mentioned today, is really, really important. They're delivering it in English and Arabic, and not in Urdu or Somali or whatever. So it's knowledge is becoming more accessible. And they've also started availing of the seminaries and new institutes that are offering full-time or part-time alima courses, as we've discussed today. Increasingly, these are opening up to women, although as work has shown, the curriculum often is not as rigorous as that provided for men. Also, the importance of institutions such as Cambridge Muslim College or Ibrahim College. A lot of the female authorities I spoke to had actually been through these institutes or were hoping to, or similar types of institutions where they were learning to contextualize their knowledge, and that was really important to their study. And many are also pursuing master's degrees, in some cases PhDs, so they're combining that with traditional studies, similar to the men's experiences. And also importantly, they're gaining experience of student life and ISOCs and learning really about the lives of young people. And also some are also have now the opportunity to travel to the Middle East, although there are various constraints with this tied to family life and so on. And the quote that I've put under constraints shows this was something that was reiterated by many of the women that I interviewed. And the Ustada there says, scholarship is a male field, and it really feels that we're imposing ourselves. And I think a good example of this is Ustada Sofia Dorat, who I mentioned, who actually teaches also at Ibrahim College, but has set up her own institute, Al-Muhsinat. She Jabandi trained, but also spent some time in Jordan, in Cambridge Muslim College. Initially, when she started giving talks in the early 2000s, she was forced to conceal her identity. So she presented herself as Ustada bint Ahmed. And because she had when she tried to use her own name, that sparked controversy. So she just thought that was a better way of promoting her work. But now she says that's no longer really necessary. And this is because on the one hand, seminaries have been slow to accommodate women, but also many of the women I met with mentioned that their families and communities just didn't see women's education as important as men's, although many say that this is slowly changing. It's harder for them also to travel abroad, and of course there are few funding opportunities. Studying is expensive, and the job opportunities that are often tied to there are very few formal roles that often women find that they don't quite suit. And then one of the things that several people mentioned was the fact that that they're missing a community and a network of support. So one scholar said to me that in the Middle East, learning and teaching was much easier because when she went to university, she had a community that did the housework for her, that helped her with her children and so on, whereas that was missing in the UK because it was an individualized society, and that was a big barrier to her own work. So on to the second question. So does gender matter in knowledge production? What are they developing kind of female forms of knowledge? And just before I answer that question, I think it's important to note that there's a huge diversity in what scholars and teachers are doing. Thank you. Some, for example, are more active on social media. Some have are completely invisible online. This is very difficult to find them, but actually are very well known through word of mouth. Some have very strong ties to their local community. Some have more kind of international, national audience. Some deliver classes of very traditional style. Some are more kind of preachers, and the majority actually deliver women only audiences. There are only very few who deliver to mixed gendered audiences. In answering back to my question about female forms of knowledge, one of the things that came out in my work was that despite this diversity, a lot of the teachers and scholars, no matter what their role was, ended up providing advice and guidance. And in part, they're responding to a need, because young people find that they can't go to their parents because their parents' form of knowledge is seen as too cultural, not sufficiently Islamic, and also their parents might not have understanding of the British context. On the other hand, their teachers and counsellors at school or universities aren't really knowledgeable, don't have much knowledge of Islam. So in a way, female scholars are seeing themselves as providing that there's this need that they're fulfilling. At the same time, there's a gap, and perhaps male scholars aren't doing this, and so they are doing it, and it's becoming something that they end up doing more than teaching. Right? At one retreat that I went to, one of the scholars spent all night giving personal advice to the sisters there. And some of them are also now seeking counselling training. But also, I think they're starting to see also their work more broadly as guidance. So one young scholar from Birmingham drew on sort of a Sufi heritage to celebrate women saints as female role models, but also looking at how these teachings then applied to contemporary problems in Britain. Sophia Dorat, who I mentioned, really one of her Quran, I attended her Quran course, and she really presents the Quran as a form of guidance that guides everyone, Muslims, non-Muslims, but in particular provides clear solutions to the problems that young Muslim women face in the UK. One of the interesting things is that when I spoke to scholars and teachers about their role as guides, many of them saw it as something uniquely feminine, and that they sort of naturalize their roles as guides. And so one ustada in Liverpool said, women's brains are wired in particular ways, while men have a spot for compassion, we have several. Another, this is kind of their take on, it's their perspective on understanding their roles. Another ustada in London said women understand humans, and that's key. So in a way, they're seeing this guidance and teaching is also able to then cater, to individual needs and establish more intimate and less hierarchical relationships between student and teachers. They also see their shared experiences as wives, sisters, mothers, as them being able to relate to their students in very intimate ways, but also able to adapt knowledge to suit individual needs, and able to understand the community better, so to be more flexible, more adaptable. One scholar said, we can't be textbook or theory the whole time. And then finally, several of the authorities I met with emphasized the importance that guidance was not just about telling people what to do, but also listening and embodying the teachings. So this idea of embodied knowledge was key. And related to that, many saw themselves as not only supporting individual women's spiritual growth, so it's not a sort of individualized form of guidance, but really as encouraging women to be then the core of their communities. And I think this relates partly to what Dr. Nugjeeb was saying earlier, that this intellectual contribution. And I think these scholars are making an intellectual contribution, and then they're presenting sort of alternative ways of engaging with society, offering alternatives to, for example, the individualism that they find in British society, the absence of family and societal networks, by valuing women's caring role and putting women really at the core of their communities. But they're not doing this. They're not providing an intellectual contribution by perhaps talking about it or writing about it, they're doing it through their their kind of embodied experience of it, and that's why it's perhaps less visible. And yeah, I'm there. I'm at the conclusion. And their experiences, I've been to visit many of their spaces of teaching and learning, really show how they're beginning to experiment with these alternative communities. So we're starting from their own families, local spaces and communities, and drawing on ideas of care and cooperation and women's ability, women's natural ability to understand human behavior, and using that to think through about how they engage with non-Muslims, care for nature, the environment, community work, and caring for the less fortunate, and so on. I'd like to give examples, but I've run out of time. So just 2 words to conclude. The rise of female authorities has led to a position of women in position of leadership, but also, I think, new forms of authority and new forms of Islamic knowledge that are presented as distinctly female and British. And of course, not all authorities are doing this. These are sort of the emerging themes from my work, and some see themselves as doing very similar work to men's, but I think there is this dimension of doing something different. And they are, but at the same time, drawing from the Islamic tradition and trying to contextualize it in particular ways that provide solution to the problems that Muslim women face in the British context. And many are asserting the superiority of the Islamic framework as well, as more supportive than that they find in liberal British society. But they're also arguing for more spaces for Muslim women in religious institutions and in public life in Britain. And from what I see, they're beginning to carve a space for themselves as guides and teachers. And whereas this guidance might be seen as traditionally inferior and perhaps something, maybe the work that men don't want to do, or I think research has shown, and particularly the research here at Cardiff as well, the Muslim Chaplains research project and other work has shown that guidance is becoming increasingly important in the British context and valued in particular ways. So perhaps that's really important to what's happening here. And in fact, my research has also shown that young people are actually more likely to go to individual scholars, such as these female scholars, for advice on everyday issues rather than going to a mufti, for example, because they feel less intimidated. So the role of Islamic guidance is becoming increasingly important, and these female scholars are availing of these opportunities while developing a unique form of religious authority. And I think in so doing, they're also conceptualizing guidance as not only focused on the individual, but as potentially transformative of society at large. Thank you. Thanks for listening.